We should now undertake a discussion on parliamentary privileges. And there is a reason behind this. There is a reason why we must have a discussion on parliamentary privileges. And that is because, if you think about it, parliamentary privileges have a direct correlation with disruptions of the parliament. This could happen internally as well, and this could happen externally also. A simple way to understand is defamation, contempt, and this is contempt of court, and parliamentary privileges are actually three sides of the same coin. While defamation is about ridiculing any person at large, contempt is about ridiculing the court, and parliamentary privileges are about the parliament. Now, with contempt and privileges, there are two dimensions to this. One is say contempt of the court and contempt of the judge. Privileges is again privileges of the member of the parliament and privileges as the composition of the parliament as a whole. Now, how multiple people can be charged with contempt? The lawyers can be charged with contempt, the judge can be charged with contempt, and anybody who has something to say about the court may be charged with contempt. Similarly, the members of the houses could be charged with contempt, or anybody else who comments in such a way that it ridicules the house could also be charged with contempt. So let's understand this. So when we talk about parliamentary privileges, it of course has a lot to do with disruptions, and the fact that our MPs have been protected under certain constitutional immunities also add to their privileges. So let's understand what exactly do we mean by a parliamentary privilege. See, a parliamentary privilege very simply are the rights and the immunities which are enjoyed by the parliament as an institution and MPs in their individual capacity, as I was telling you about, without which they cannot discharge their functions which the constitution has given to them. Now you must understand why. If the parliament is a lawmaking body, the parliament is a discussion forum, the parliament is a grievance redressal forum, the grievances are going to be against somebody. The discussion may not be appreciated by a certain section of people. So there are tough and difficult calls that will have to be made. There are always going to be discussions which will have to be made in a certain way, which is why parliamentary privileges are to protect the integrity of discussions and lawmaking in the House. That's the legislative intent behind parliamentary privileges. Now, according to the Constitution, the powers and the privileges and the immunities of the Parliament and the MPs have to be defined by the Parliament. Now, unfortunately, the Parliament has not enacted any law as such, and therefore in the absence of such a law, what we usually follow are British parliamentary conventions. I'll give you a bunch of those as to what they are, but we do not have a codified law. And the UPSC in the previous year questions have also asked you that why do we not have a codified law and how could we solve this problem? Now, so what is a breach of privilege? A breach of the privilege is basically a violation of any of the privileges of the MPs or the Parliament. Among other things, any action which is causing or casting quote-unquote reflections on MPs, parliaments or his committees could be considered as a breach of privilege. For example, if you're publishing news items which are derogatory in nature, which are not factually correct in nature, editorials or statements which are made in public speeches, in newspapers, in magazines, in TV interviews, of course, if you have a reasonable basis and what you are saying is fundamentally true, and what you are saying is saying in a proper parliamentary fashion, nobody is going to say anything to you. But if you say something just to, violate the decency and the integrity of the House, of course, there is going to be a problem. Right. Now, what are the privileges that we're talking about? The MPs and the MLAs basically enjoy three kinds of privileges. First, the freedom of speech in the House, which means they cannot be prosecuted or for saying or doing anything in the House. They have this freedom from arrest for 40 days prior or after a session of the legislature, or during the session or from the premises of the legislature without the permission of the House. It basically means that you have a certain freedom. and the legislature has the powers to regulate its internal affairs, which means it is the legislature who will decide on issues such as disruptions, vandalism, violence, and all of those things. The courts or the police simply cannot interfere. And if the legislature decides, then you can punish the MP or the MLA, you can send them to jail, you can suspend them from the house, or there could be also a fine imposed. Very interestingly, and this is something that I've covered in a YouTube video on the constitutional loophole on corruption, and there is a case which is actually currently pending in the Supreme Court, wherein an MLA from a state basically took a bribe to vote a certain way in a Rajya Sabha election. Now there was a CBI inquiry. Against the MLA. That the bribe that was taken was of course a violation of the Corruption Act, and therefore you should be charged. The MLA said that the CBI cannot interfere, and even if the MLA has taken a bribe to vote a certain way in the Rajya Sabha, the MLA enjoys provisions of immunities under the Constitution, and therefore nothing can be done. And now the Supreme Court is looking into whether an exception or whether a clarification on the law is needed. Otherwise, this is a massive legal loophole which seems to be problematic. Okay. So are we clear on this? Now, the constitutionality in terms of its origin are very simple. Articles 105 of the Constitution and 194 of the Constitution essentially give you immunities to MPs and MLAs. The elected representatives can claim these privileges only till the time they're a member of the House. This is not a post-retirement benefit. And basically the argument has been, as I was telling you, is because we want to maintain the integrity and the honesty of constitutional functions, which is why we need these things in the first place. Now, what can be done and what has been done so far? So, to give you a little bit of a recent context, very recently several MPs have been suspended from attending the winter session of the Rajya Sabha because of the disruptions that they had caused in the previous monsoon session, largely to do with farm laws and other things. So, what can basically happen is the House can ask the person to come to the House and explain. The person could then therefore be given a warning or could be sent to prison or a fine and so on and so forth. I'll give you three very specific cases with three very specific outcomes. So in 1967, there were two people who were held to be in contempt of the Rajya Sabha, okay, for throwing leaflets from the visitors gallery. In 1983, one person was held for breach of shouting slogans and throwing chappals from the visitors gallery. Now both of them were sent to prison. In 2007, Ambassador Ronan Singh basically had said something with respect to the Parliament and certain functions. The Lok Sabha Committee on Privileges basically said that Ambassador Ronan Singh had used the word headless chickens, and therefore it's he was generally saying the word headless chickens in the context of the Parliament in general, and the committee said, you know what, it's okay. He wasn't specifically talking about us. We are not headless chickens. We have a head. So no action was taken against him. In 2008, an Urdu newspaper, which essentially has a weekly edition, called the deputy chairman of the Rajya Sabha a coward for attributing certain decisions that the Rajya Sabha deputy chairman had taken. Though the privilege committee held the editor guilty, but here also no action was taken, which means there is absolutely no uniformity on what needs to be done and what doesn't need to be done as far as these things are concerned. Now, you must understand the extent of disruptions that have happened, and you must understand why it is very important to take these actions, but take these actions in the right manner. I mean, don't unnecessarily punish people to have a view, but at the same time, make sure that what is wrong is actually penalized. That is why, whether it is contempt or privileges, the larger arguments actually remain the same. because this is a legal issue as much as this is an ethical issue, right? You have the right to issue contempt, you have the right to assert on a privilege motion, but does it mean you start suppressing a freedom of expression, right? So it becomes a larger conflict between freedom of expression versus the integrity of the house. Which is more important, or integrity of the organization? In the case of the contempt, it becomes the court, and in case of privileges, it becomes the parliament. So the monsoon session, as we know, was the third least productive Lok Sabha session in the last 2 decades. Now, in the current winter session, we've done very well. The houses are working very productively, but they're spending a lot of their time on non-legislative business. The worst session in the history of this country was the winter session of 2010, largely because of the protests that were happening due to the 2G scam. The winter sessions of 2013 and 2016 were the second worst hit in terms of productivity, because in 2013 there were protests on separation of Andhra Pradesh, and in 2016, of course, demonetization had caused a lot of this. Now, in March 2020, there were 7 Congress MPs. Gaurav Gogoi was one of the most well-known people out of those. Was suspended from the Lok Sabha for the rest of the budget session. They were accused of snatching papers from the speaker's table, and the opposition, because the opposition wanted a very detailed discussion on the Delhi riots, which of course had unimaginable damage to life and property. Now, what happens here is, in 2021, there is a Supreme Court judgment. The Supreme Court judgment actually is not about the Parliament, but is about state legislatures, and very specifically with respect to Kerala, where an MLA in the Kerala Legislative Assembly started to destroy the property. So, the Supreme Court ruled that very clearly that representatives will not be let go free for acts of vandalism and violence which are committed inside the house, and therefore you cannot claim immunity for vandalism. The Supreme Court judgment, now this is an important judgment, you don't need to know the name of it as such, but this is an important judgment which takes away the protections of privileges and immunities, and therefore making them liable for prosecution under acts. Now, it says that destruction of assembly is not equated to freedom of speech because it is a reasonable restriction. Second, it is not not an escape route from criminality, because that would be a betrayal of citizens. And the third is, we had the legislative intent behind privileges or immunities were to essentially ensure that they perform their functions in peace. They perform their functions without fear. But not to bypass a certain system, and this has to be done within the broad parameters of certain conditions in which they have to work. So that is a very important Supreme Court judgment. Now, there are 2 basic solutions that are important. First is, in 2019, they were having a conference of presiding officers in Dehradun, presiding officers of all the houses. The idea of a parliament disruption index was mooted, that we will rank the MPs and we'll rank the houses as to which house is the most disruptive. Of course, this has not taken any action yet. And second is, on the case of disruption, the first issue should be automatic suspension, and then you can have an inquiry as to whether the person should be led back into the house or not. Okay, so this is more than enough as far as immunities and privileges is concerned, and should give you enough content and data to essentially run things accordingly. Okay, so that's that. Thank you. We'll now move to the next topic.